Joining me right now is Jim DeMint. Everyone knows Jim DeMint, former senator, chairman with the Conservative Partnership Institute. And Jim DeMint is also on the Economic Revival Task Force. Now, this is the task force that has been assembled by the administration to guide the reopening of America. And he joins us now on the phone. So good to have you, and hope you've been staying well and cabin fever free.
Yes, Dana, I have been staying well and doing a lot of work over the phone, and thank goodness some of the country can do that. But unfortunately, for a lot of folks, they have been sent home, and some companies that could actually keep their employees, as you were mentioning, are furloughing them because they can collect money for sending them home. So I think there are a lot of small businesses who are not going to get anything, and there are a lot of businesses who are going to play the system and get more than they should, and that's what happens anytime you ask the government to try to redistribute resources that can only be distributed properly by the private sector.
Right, and that has been one of these problems. And to ask you about that, because, and I understand that especially when we were everyone was rushing to fill this void that was created by, and the best way that I can put it is this. It's a quasi-financial eminent domain, because you have these businesses and these individuals whose ability to engage in commerce and earn a living was seized temporarily due to this pandemic. And so the way that it's being presented, though, in the press, and we're speaking with Jim DeMint, who is on the Economic Revival Task Force, they're presenting it as, Republicans are just running around giving checks to Ruth's Chris and everything else while these small businesses are starving. That's not accurate. But how is it that some of these bigger companies like Shake Shack, who's giving back a $10 million loan, how did that happen? And what is the process for approving those?
Well, there's so much bureaucracy and regulations. And of course, the big companies have legal teams and accounting teams that know exactly how to get the most out of government. And a lot of them were in the room negotiating how this was written. And sometimes small businesses, it just took them a long time to find out really how to process this. And trying to get trillions of dollars through the SBA is like trying to get the ocean through a straw. Yeah. They're just not set up to do that. But they're working on it. They're trying to work it out. It's unfortunate to see the Democrats playing a game when the money for the small businesses should have been replenished a couple of weeks ago, but the Democrats had to get something for their causes, their left-wing causes, and apparently they're going to get some of what they want, but they're already talking about another tranche of stimulus. And Dana, I think the best thing we can do, and the only thing that's going to work, is just to open the country back up. This has gone from a healthcare crisis to an economic and political crisis. Our whole system is in jeopardy now, and I think we're in a good position to get people to go back to work safely.
I think we are as well, and we noted a little bit earlier in the program that you have certain states like Georgia and other areas that are actually, according to the IMHE models, that are on the other side of those peaks. And all of the reopening, of course, is done within those federal guidelines, those suggestions to states to safely open up. If you meet this grading criteria, you can go into phase one. Georgia is one of the first states that's going to be reopening. Texas looking to going into that phase one as well. I mean, there's a way to do this, but you bring up an important point that you're going to see a lot more turmoil as well by keeping the economy shuttered for so long. I had a number of stories showing how prescriptions for antidepressants, anti-anxiety, sleeping medication prescriptions, not just over the counter, have increased between anywhere from 18 to 33%. And this is going to continue the longer the economy stays closed. Why is it that why are some people so resistant to acknowledging that great tragedy that's getting ready to happen the longer this goes on?
Well, that's the political side of this, Dana, is the Democrats and the media clearly want to keep the economy shut down. They want Trump to be presiding over a terrible economy. And they're going to say he responded too slowly to the virus and people died, and then he overreacted and killed the economy. And now we want to extend unemployment benefits. I mean, they're going to make a lot of commercials out of this, and I think he understands this. And to his credit, Dana, I mean, he sacrificed the greatest accomplishment of his administration, which was the economy, in order to save lives. And he's listened to doctors who were going on worst case scenarios and modeling that they didn't have enough data. And now we're seeing, I think once all is said and done, that probably the mortality of this coronavirus is not much worse than the flu that we face every year. And probably millions and millions of Americans have already gotten it and have an immunity. So I'm not trying to play doctor here,
Right.
but I do know that they have overstated the threat. And for most young Americans who are healthy, they have very little risk from this anyway. So we've got to get the country back to work, because we can't keep printing money to pay people to be idle or pay companies to stay closed. And that's what we're doing. We're printing money. We're not even really borrowing it. We can't borrow any more money. And we just, when you have people in Congress saying $350 billion is nothing, I mean, they're out of control up there now. That is a huge amount of money, and it will take us years and years to dig out from under the economic devastation that we're getting ready to see here in this country.
Yeah, and included in that, you mentioned a little bit earlier, we're speaking with Jim DeMint, who, of course, is on that Economic Revival Task Force has the job of guiding the country into that economic reopening. We've been hearing, we've played sound bites of Nancy Pelosi stating this, and even Chuck Schumer has discussed this to a degree, where we have to consider, and I'm sure you've heard this as well, we have to consider additional stimulus for states that might be in debt. But what they're leaving out for the public is that a lot of these states, like for instance, Illinois and J.B. Pritzker, there has been requesting some more stimulus funding. I'm from Missouri. My executive producer was born and raised in Illinois. Illinois has had problems predating this coronavirus. They have been struggling with debt. They have one of the highest tax rates, but yet they don't have nothing to show for it. That's not the responsibility of the American people to pay that off through the guise of pandemic spending. That's shady. How are we going to stop that?
Dana, that is a big issue, and I've known this was going to happen because Illinois, New York, California, several other states are on the verge of bankruptcy anyway. And some of the big financial companies that got us in trouble in '08 have been loaning them money, which they knew they can't pay back. Mm-hmm. So we've got a too big to fail situation. And I guarantee you what they're going to do is just like with the TARP bailout, is you're going to have 4 or 5 big states who need a real bailing out of their pension plans and a lot of other things. And they're going to try to give money to all the other states so they don't complain. That's what they did with all the little banks who didn't need money in '08. Yeah. But what they're going to do is try to get low tax states and the taxpayers in those states who haven't been spending carelessly like New York. They're going to try to get these states to bail out those other states. And it's going to be a fight here, but you can see already they're going to use this virus as an excuse for a whole lot of things that have nothing to do with the virus.
Boy, that's a thing to sell people like Texans on San Jacinto Day as well. That the week of San Jacinto Day, that's a thing to sell Texans on. But it's a real problem, and it gets into, this is why it's so important to support responsible stewards of tax dollars, because now these states that have been so poorly ran, they got themselves in the situation where they didn't plan on a pandemic because they're just irresponsible. To that, another quick question for you here as we wrap up. One of the questions that was asked of the president yesterday had to do with liability for businesses that are slowly reopening according to the healthcare guidelines that have been laid out at numerous press conferences. And I realize that workers' compensation would likely exclude this, but in a pandemic, I don't know how much that changes it. Is that a concern that you have on the Economic Revival Task Force, the liability for businesses, and whether or not that's going to maybe perhaps stifle or reduce the speed of reopening because of concerns for liability if there's if an outbreak or something else takes place?
It's been my number one concern, and when the president asked me last week on a telephone call, that was the first thing I told him, because I was in business for 25 years myself, and I know what's going to happen if someone goes back to work, catches a disease, and gets sick or even dies. Those companies are going to be sued. I mean, that's what the trial bar does. I mean, and they're going to say the company knew the risk, they brought them back. I mean, and unless the president uses his powers under the emergency declaration to absolve businesses, all businesses, as well as hospitals, doctors, from liability related to the coronavirus. You're going to see a lot of businesses who are afraid to open up, but because they know the risk involved. And so I'm really concerned about that, and I'm not sure that the president can actually do that under the emergency declaration, but I've asked them to look at it and see what they can do, because this will be, another large, class action type thing going on for years if we don't fix it right now.
Yeah, and I definitely understand that. And I was talking to a lawyer friend of mine who was saying that he was surmising that, well, maybe some of this might be meritless, and you would have some things under workers' compensation, but I don't know if pandemic falls underneath that. But even then, that doesn't mean that people wouldn't try, and that's an expense for a lot of businesses, particularly the more individuals that you have doing it. And for some of these smaller businesses that are just struggling to make sure that they're satisfying PPE criteria, that could be, then they could reopen only to shut down because of something like this.
Exactly. It's a sue and settle situation. The lawyers don't have to plan on winning, but they can make a small business spend $1,000 just dealing with the depositions and what you have to do to even get to court. And even if the business wins, they don't get their money back. And so a lot of them just can't do it. And we're already going to see a lot of bankruptcies. And if you put the expense of liability on top of businesses, you're going to see more and more of them close down rather than have to deal with this.
What words of encouragement do you have for all of the business owners out there that are really looking to that economic revival task force, and they're watching every single press conference every afternoon as they get ready to, in some states, go into phase one?
Well, you'll see the president this week begin to balance at his briefings the health care with the economics. And Mark Meadows, who's now the chief of staff, is presiding over a large part of this economic revival team. And the protocols are not just for large companies, but the more and more the task force is including, retailers, restaurants, theaters, other people who just, even churches where folks gather, is we've got to kind of set the risk aside. The other thing I've asked the president to do, Dana, which I'll hope we'll have right away, if the real demographic and medical profiles of people who are most affected by this disease are actually published, I think we would see that working, healthy Americans have very little risk at all from this disease, and it's only folks who are generally older with pre-existing conditions. Now, obviously there are a few exceptions there, as there are with any disease, but I think you've got the working Americans who can safely go back to work at very little risk to themselves. So I would just encourage businesses to begin to open. If there's not an edict from your governor, which is something we're going to have to revisit when this is over, because they really don't have that authority. But let's just start opening back up. I've heard some ads now for restaurants here in South Carolina that's saying they've got seating times now. It's not just takeout. So folks are kind of testing the limits here, and we need to get back out, because the risk of staying in and closed down are greater than the risk of going out.
Absolutely. We are so happy to get some clarification on that. Jim DeMint with the Economic Revival Task Force. We always appreciate your sound wisdom. Thank you so much for joining us, sir, and we look forward to speaking with you again.